morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. It's Wednesday, September 30th, 2020, and on this episode, I am definitely 100% not going to talk about last night's wrestling match. So if you're looking for that, there's plenty of people who are going to share their quick hot takes on that elsewhere. So instead today, I want to dig in kind of bigger picture on the problems that we face today. So I've got some timeless quotes from 6 leading founders and old revolutionaries on the nature and extent of government power and how it grows once it just barely starts. I got a few more on what needs to be done about that. And then I've got my own maybe 3 or 4 key takeaways based on the state of things today on where we need to go. But first of all, before getting to that, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. You can find everything you need to follow this show at our show homepage, which is 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. It's all spelled out. I am so grateful for you spending some of your time with me here today. Thank you very much for joining me. On that show homepage, you're going to get everything. All the platforms we're on, video and audio, live streaming and archive, the podcast editions, iTunes, Spotify, elsewhere. All the episodes we've ever done for over 2 years. And on individual episodes, I include a ton of links. On this episode, for example, I've got links to original source quotes, documents, papers, books, speeches, etc. from the founders that I'm going to be citing on this episode. So it's always a great resource and research tool for you going forward. You can also find ways to support us, like our membership program, which starts out as little as $2 a month, and do not feel obligated to join us. But if you can pitch in, I'd be very grateful for any consideration you can give to putting your financial faith behind our work. Again, that's 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And for those of you who hate waiting for me to go through all this introduction, I'm very grateful for you doing so anyways, because since we are primarily a live show, and I know a lot of people come and listen to the archive, but I love doing the live program, and this allows all the platforms the time to give people notifications for them to join us. So thank you so much for your patience and for being here. A quick hello out to everyone in the live chat. Hi to Funky Euphemism, Kuchelane, WC, Tyler B, Lawrence Smith, Irwin over on Periscope. That's pretty cool. Bob Landry in San Antonio. Funky Euphemism, Clay Kent, Richard Banks, MRGF, Dan Reed, good to see you, buddy. Pro-Life, Pro-Liberty, Shane Lackey, and everyone else. Our live streaming channels are Periscope, DLive, Twitch, Periscope, and Facebook and YouTube. I hope to add some to that as they are more available. So as new platforms allow us to do some live streaming, maybe library.tv will have that available in the near future. We'll definitely jump on those. Please let me know when you see those. I know gab.com is pushing for a TV product, and hopefully they'll have some live streaming as well. Anyways, let's get right to this. I want to start out with some of these quotes, and I think the first one is a great one to look at. Let me pull this up on the screen so you can kind of follow along if you're taking a look here. And here we go. Maybe I have this incorrect. I do have the wrong screen up here. Hold on a second. I'm going to change this so you can actually see what I'm doing. There we go. Here's from James Otis Jr., April 27th, 1767. And here's how he put it. A free government never degenerated into tyranny all at once. It is the work of years. I think this is such a timeless statement. Otis recognized this in the middle of the 18th century, and obviously he wasn't the first to point this out. Maybe he was the most prominent of that generation. But for them to have understood this at that time, and so many people today think that everything bad is based off of one election or one appointment or one whatever, they're missing the entire structure of the problem that we face today. And that is, we live under the largest government and the largest empire in the history of the world. It's not even close. And we didn't get from point A to point B, or actually point Z, in one step. It wasn't about electing the wrong person into the White House. It wasn't about the wrong Congress. It is precedent upon precedent upon precedent and other actions turning a blind eye to bad things and allowing them to be done because you like the team in power, or people in the past have done that. Or they thought that a short-term consolidation of power was something that would be good to fix a certain problem today, but in the long run, someone's going to use that power in a bad way. So in essence, what we have to do whenever we look at something that we're advocating for government to do rather than getting out of the way. In most every situation, I think government should just stop doing what they're doing. It needs to get out of the way. It won't do that, and I'm going to have some solution talk on that a little bit briefly near the end of this episode. Anyways, Otis goes on. He says, there is nothing, however, will in the end more surely work the destruction of liberty than a prevailing opinion that it is better to tamely submit than nobly assert and vindicate our privileges. So when they violate our rights, a lot of people would rather have the calm of despotism. Thomas Jefferson said, timid men, at one point he said, timid men prefer the calm of despotism rather than the tempestuous sea of liberty. And we've known that this has been a problem all along. And that's what Otis warned about. When you turn a blind eye because it's too much work, it's too trouble, or you like what's going on in the short term, eventually that free government will degenerate into tyranny over years. And now we're talking a few centuries later, and we certainly live under a despotic system. Even if they aren't violating your rights to exist right now, they have the power to do it. And should someone else in the future want to use that power in even worse ways, we shouldn't be surprised when they do. Anyways, that's James Otis Jr. in 1767. Next up is John Dickinson. This is from his letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania in 1767 and 1768 against the hated Townshend Acts. I've cited this particular passage a number of times, but I think it bears repeating over and over and over and over until more people hear this and understand the problem we face. And he's citing, I think this is in letter 9. I will link to this in the show notes, of course, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. And Dickinson, the penman of the Revolution, this is where he built a lot of his fame, was in response to the Townshend Acts in the pre-revolutionary times, or in the early revolutionary days. And he's talking about Spain. He says, Spain, at one point, Spain was once free. Their Cortes, that's their parliament, resembled our parliaments. No money could be raised on the subject without their consent. In other words, they had to go through a very particular process in order to raise funds for anything. There were no emergency powers. Spain, as Dickinson pointed out, now he didn't use this phrase, they weren't allowed to just have, quote, an emergency and now we can do something new because there's a dangerous scenario. No, even in a dangerous scenario, they still had to go through the process because the process is what prevented arbitrary power. All the founders regularly warned us against arbitrary power. Arbitrary power when government can determine the extent of its own powers or create an environment where there's an emergency and say, well, we can just do what we need to do now. That is a system of tyranny. We were told that over and over and over again without limits. When government can do what it wants through fear, and John Adams warned us that fear is the foundation of most governments, when they can use fear, they're going to see everything as a fearful situation to whip up the population into obedience and submission for emergency powers. Well, that sounds familiar, doesn't it? So he said no money could be raised on the subject without their consent. But one of the kings was in a war, wanted to have a war, to maintain a war against the Moors. And he needed money. And he needed money for that war, of course. Did he? Or maybe he just wanted the power. That king wanted to maintain the money, and Parliament wasn't on board. They couldn't do it at that time. Maybe they weren't in session or something. And so he wanted to actually get permission. And he said, in that emergency, for that emergency only. And Dickinson put that in italics because he's emphasizing that, look, they're just selling it to the situation, to the people as, well, just this one emergency. We can raise money without assembling Parliament to go through the debate on this publicly and actually make a determination whether or not they were going to raise that cash. That doesn't mean that Parliament wouldn't have just handed the money over. But what they're doing is they're handing the power over to the king. So you're further centralizing the decision-making over raising money for a war. And in essence, the ability to even go to war at that time, because if they didn't have the money raised, they didn't have the printing press like we do now So they were, in essence, centralizing that power in one person's hand. And we know all through history that the further that power is centralized, the more likely it's going to be abused, because it's a single point of failure. It's a single person making the decision, and that's going to draw the worst type of people to that type of power. Those people love having power because they can use it. Going on, Dickinson says that request was violently opposed by the best and wisest men in the assembly. It was, however, complied with by the votes of a majority. So they said just this one emergency. And this single concession, he writes, was a precedent. He put that in all caps like it was an email forward. Precedent was in all caps. It was a precedent for other concessions of the like kind, until at last the Crown obtained a general power of raising money in cases of necessity. So what starts out as one single emergency, one concern allowing them to do one thing today, will always be used over time. As Otis told us the year earlier, a free government never degenerated into tyranny all at once. It's the work of years. And Dickinson, the following year, gave us a very powerful example of how that played out over time. So it started out with that one emergency because there's a war. You don't want a bunch of people to die, so you got to protect the country. Allow them to just do what they want to do and raise the money they want without following the process. Eventually, it's going to be another emergency, another emergency, another emergency, and on and on and on, until it's no longer emergency, but need. And that's what we live under today. And Dickinson summed it up by saying, from that period, the Cortes ceased to be useful, and the people ceased to be free. And he signed it off with a very important Latin phrase that I can't pronounce. Anyways, it means oppose a disease at its beginning. John Dickinson, that was in probably 68 by the time that one was published. Then let's go to 1785, Thomas Jefferson's Notes on Virginia. He said, he's talking about separations of powers, but he's giving us a bit of a prediction, and I think he was pretty prophetic here. He said they should look forward to a time, and that not a distant one. He's expecting in the somewhat near future, under what was happening already, when a corruption in this, as in the country from which we derive our origin, will have seized the heads of government and be spread by them through the body of the people, when they will purchase the voices of the people and make them pay the price. In other words, there is going to be corruption and vote buying. Oh, they're going to hand out this and that in order to have the support of the people. That's certainly what we have today. My only thought, I'm not going to talk about debates. I'm definitely not going to talk about debates. If I do that, you should just leave, because it is just... Anyways, Jefferson goes on. He says, the time to guard against corruption and tyranny is before they shall have gotten a hold of us. It is better to keep the wolf out of the fold than to trust to drawing his teeth and talons after he shall have entered. Now, the bad news, of course, the wolf has certainly entered, and the sheep are getting eaten up. And the sheep are actually volunteering to be dinner over and over today. Now, certainly we can't go back in time and say, well, let's oppose what's already happened before it happens. That hasn't been invented yet. But new powers, we certainly need to take that into consideration anytime someone wants to centralize power or have government exercise a power that it hasn't exercised in the past for whatever emergency, for whatever necessity. You have to think, how will someone in the future use this power? People are so short-term in their thinking. They only think in the now. They think in the moment. They don't think in historical. They don't think in how it might play out in the future. And this is a very dangerous thing. This is a kind of a hedonistic approach. Like, how can I feel about this process today? And it's really bad because it always encourages more power in the future. The time to guard against it is today, always. That's Thomas Jefferson. And speaking of wolves, that's what Benjamin Franklin said. He was actually highlighting an old phrase. He was basically saying, there is truth into this old phrase. This is a letter to Jane Mecom, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, in November of 1773, he says, make yourselves sheep and the wolves will eat you. So as long as you remain timid, as long as you remain obedient, the wolves are going to come out and take everything from you over time. And they may not take everything from you personally today, but maybe your children, your grandchildren. And every time we have that precedent, we're certainly creating a situation where the people cease to be free. And one other on this, well, I've got two more. One here from Richard Henry Lee. This was in his series of federal farmer letters. This is number 4 in October of 1787. And he points out that men who govern will in doubtful cases construe laws and constitutions most favorably for increasing their own power. So even if we're recognizing that government will always, or people who want power, who have power, will always cry emergency, cry fear, war, necessity for a little bit more power today, and will always expand in the future, even with a constitution. The founders weren't telling us, and I pointed this out in an episode dedicated to it, but a number of times, that even the leading Federalists of the time, the supporters of the Constitution, didn't expect the Constitution to enforce itself. They may have had some unrealistic expectations about the nature of the people and how their moral position would stand over time, but they recognized, all of them, that power does corrupt and power always expands. So even if you have a great constitution, John Dickinson, for example, said a good constitution promotes but does not guarantee good administration of government. You can have the best constitution, but if you don't pay attention to the bigger picture, to what's being done, you're going to have a lot of problems. And that's basically what Richard Henry Lee is saying here in 1787. This is Federal Farmer number 4, October of 1787. Even if you have the best, the clearest, the plainest English, the plainest language in the document, people who govern, people who have power, will always try to construe those words to expand their own powers. And we hear this happen all the time today. So he goes on, he says, all wise and prudent people in forming constitutions have drawn the line and carefully described the powers parted with and the powers reserved. This is just wanted to quick add that section because Richard Henry Lee, like many others, was a great tenther, at least in principle, before it even existed. And the last one in this series that I want to cover is John Adams. This was, again, back when he was a good guy in 1775. This is a letter to his wife, Abigail Adams, in July. He says, our consolation, it might sound, when you hear it at first, this one sounds pretty negative, like pretty hopeless for what we face right now. He says, our consolation must be this, my dear, that cities may be rebuilt, and a people reduced to poverty may acquire fresh property. But a constitution of government, once changed from freedom, can never be restored. Ooh, was Adams right? Possibly, but it certainly is a stark warning. He says, liberty once lost is lost forever. It's not like government will ever, once you allow government to have power to do one thing for one emergency or one necessity or one situation, it's not like the next people who are in power of that same government, even if they choose not to exercise that power today, because they don't have the same emergency claim that they may have had from the previous administration of government. It's not like they're going to say, well, let's get rid of this. That just doesn't happen anymore. It almost never does. You'll find small examples of let's overturn this for that, but there's a general increasing of government no matter who's in power at every level, really. If you look at a big picture, you zoom out, you look at the charts, that's what you're going to see. He says, when people, and this is the qualification that Adams gave that I think is really interesting, that I've had to read through a number of times over the years for it to really resonate with me. He says, when the people once surrender their share in the legislature and their right of defending the limitations upon the government and of resisting every encroachment upon them, they can never regain it. So there's 3 things that Adams is saying here. Once liberty is lost, if you are surrendering your share in the legislature, if the legislature is basically not really representing the people, and I don't think it really does today, or if it does, it's representing something, it's telling us something else, that the people have very, very bad views on the Constitution and liberty, and that's probably very true as well. But once they surrender their share in the legislature and their right of defending the limitations upon government, I think for certain number 2 is gone. Because what most people have done is they've delegated their right of defending the limitations upon government to the government itself. They've basically said the limitations of government are not going to be determined by the people of the several states, the sovereign. It's going to be determined by part of the federal government. And even the limitations of the power of the state governments is also going to be handed to the federal government. Total centralization of all of this in the hands of 9 unelected, unaccountable, politically connected lawyers. That's not the system that the founders set up. Now, there were some people who wanted that kind of system in what was called the Virginia Plan, but it was considered and rejected at the Philadelphia Convention, and the people of the several states in the ratifying conventions never even considered that as an option. It barely passed the way it was. If there was even more centralization of power and that type of situation coming, there's no chance it would have existed. So if they give up their right of defending the limitations upon government, I believe the people have done that for a long time. Primarily since 1925, we're talking about the incorporation doctrine through the 14th Amendment, where the people basically allowed the judiciary to create that out of thin air, or we'll say, interpreting things like that, if I want to be a little bit more middle of the road. And then number 3, and of resisting, when the people give up the right of resisting every encroachment upon them. And I think that goes hand in hand. So it's a kind of a twofer there. If you're going to basically say the limits of government are going to be decided by that government itself, you're basically handing off what determines those limits. And then you're also handing off your right of resisting every encroachment, because what you're saying is the judiciary will make that determination for us. The government itself is going to tell us when we can resist. It's not the people making the final decision. The judiciary is now the sovereign, the final authority in the American system. So as long as the ability to resist isn't gone, and I think it's still there, it is still happening to some degree. It's not enough. It is actually probably, in a way, it's probably more than it has ever been in modern times. But in comparison to the largest government in the history of the world, it's still a very small fraction of what needs to be done over the coming years. So that makes me think of a quote that I cited on Monday's episode from some of George Washington's original Supreme Court justices. I want to reiterate this one from James Iredale. This was July 29, 1788, in the North Carolina ratifying convention. He points out that abuse may happen in any government. Doesn't matter how good the Constitution is again. Here's a leading supporter of the Constitution, a Federalist. He wasn't a big government guy in the mold of Wilson or Morris or Hamilton, but he certainly was not an anti-Federalist, and he ended up being appointed to the Supreme Court by George Washington. So he says, abuse may happen in any government. The only resource against usurpation, that is theft of power by government, is the inherent right of the people to prevent its exercise. It is the inherent right. It's a natural right. We don't have to have it written on paper. We don't have to have a permission slip from government at any level. And we don't need a federal court or any court to tell us, well, they aren't allowed to do that, so now you can resist. It's not resisting at that point. Resisting means doing it and opposing it in various forms. It's all strategic at that point. But resistance means opposing it even when the government doesn't want you to do it. And that's how he put it. He says the people will resist if the government usurp powers not delegated to it. And I think that is part of where the supporters of the Constitution at the time of ratification had unrealistic expectations for the long term. I think they were very, very much on point in recognizing that government would always try to exercise more power, but they expected the people to also have a good understanding of the Constitution and liberty for a long time, not recognizing that, well, maybe someone did. But they certainly expected the people to resist any time government had gone beyond the lines. They certainly just went through a long, bloody revolution to secede from the kingdom, the Empire of Britain. And so they probably really felt that there was this spirit that was alive. We certainly saw that in the whiskey tax rebellion. That spirit was still alive. But going further, here's another one from Theophilus Parsons that I've cited often. Here in the Massachusetts ratifying convention in January of 1788, he says the people, again, this is the same thing, the people themselves have it in their power effectually to resist usurpation. And again, resist and usurpation. Usurpation, when government exercises powers not delegated to it, doesn't matter how big or small, any power not delegated to it is a usurpation. It's an act of treason against the sovereignty of the people, as St. George Tucker put it in 1803. And he says they can do this without being driven to an appeal to arms. He says an act of usurpation is not obligatory. It is not law, and any man may be justified in his resistance. And the last one I have in this group is from the great John Hancock, who I think was one of the first 10th Amendment supporters, basically supporting ratification of the Constitution when it was going to fail in the Massachusetts ratifying convention by recommending amendments. Primarily, the first one was what became the 10th Amendment. He wasn't the first one to be on board with this type of a message, but he and Samuel Adams are probably the most prominent. They flipped support of the Constitution in Massachusetts because of that. And when he gave his speech, he was very quiet through that convention. When he finally gave a speech to say, okay, let's get to this. This is my position. He pointed out that that there were certainly concerns, and he knew that the situation, it wasn't perfect, wasn't even close, but he's like, look, the powers reserved by the people render them secure. And that, to me, says so much. He's not saying the separation of powers between the branches in the federal government render them secure. He's not saying that a judiciary is going to strike down an overbearing executive or Congress, or an executive is going to refuse the judiciary, or what. It wasn't talking about that. He wasn't even talking about state governments. He was literally saying that the people are the ones that can actually keep themselves secure against a government violating their rights. And that is the inherent right of resistance that Iredale talked about and that so many others talked about. Now, putting this all together, I guess I gotta have a few takeaways from this. I think about this in the big picture where, of course, first of all, we can't sugarcoat anything. We are facing a massive problem, one that isn't going to be changed quickly. This is the largest government in the history of the world. And no matter who you choose to run that government will be bigger in 4 years and in 8 years and in 12 years until it cannot do that anymore. Things that can't go on forever don't. But we certainly don't want to just wait for that. Because if you wait for that, what rises out of the ashes in most of those types of situations throughout history is not an advancement of liberty, but a Mao or a Stalin or some other strong man that is going to make things worse. So we have the largest government ever, and we have a really, really serious problem for the Constitution and liberty. Two, and it's really kind of building on that, there is no silver bullet. And I've mentioned this before. And a lot of people want to sell you on a silver bullet. The only thing we need to do is elect this person, or we need this Supreme Court justice, or we need this amendment to the Constitution, and everything will be fixed. But there is no silver bullet. And I believe that people who make that promise are either totally ignorant, they're misinformed, or they're grifting. They're just trying to raise cash for a particular cause, and they're not being honest with you. They're lying to you. Three, I think education is a serious problem. And it's also a big part of the solution. So not only do we have to teach people about the proper role of the government under the Constitution, I mean, we can do that all day. And a lot of people, unfortunately, will not care. We also have to explain to people why. Why decentralization, federalism, this whole 10th Amendment concept that was created under the Constitution even before the 10th Amendment existed. Basically, the 10th Amendment didn't even add anything. It just reaffirmed a legal rule of construction, telling us how we're supposed to read the document. It was there to remind people that and the 9th working hand in hand, that certain legal truths existed in the Constitution already. So we have a serious problem in education. People need to understand how things are supposed to be, but they also have to understand why decentralization is better for every situation. And I think a lot of people want to tell people why decentralization is better for libertarians or for conservatives. But they miss the point that decentralization is better for people no matter what view. If you're going to be a socialist, a libertarian, a Republican, a conservative, a Democrat, a liberal, progressive, being able to make your decision in your own area and lead by example is always going to be the way for victory. I would teach people, no matter where they come from, whatever background they're from, that they're going to have more success doing things on a local, state, and individual level. And then number four, my fourth takeaway is, how do we achieve that decentralization? How do we get from that point Z back to point A, or even just a few letters backwards to where we're supposed to be? And that's something that we spend most of our time here at 10th Amendment Center. We do a lot of education, obviously the show, the articles and blogs, But a lot of the work that we do behind the scenes is really about actually putting these principles into practice. And for that, I want to remind you guys that we published this summer our annual. We actually combined 2 years because we were later than normal, but I think we're going to start publishing it every summer near our anniversary in June, our annual State of the Nullification Movement report. And it starts out, the quick overview published here at 10thamendmentcenter.com/report is a great quote from Samuel Adams, writing as Candidus in the Boston Gazette on October 14, 1771. He says, "Let us remember that if we suffer tamely a lawless attack upon our liberty, we encourage it and involve others in our doom." And that really sums up what I'm talking about here today. As soon as you allow one thing to happen, you're building the precedent which will ensure that over time, you'll be living under the largest government in the history of the world, like we are today. And that you have to have resistance. So now we're going to have resistance to everything new, but then also chip away at everything old at the same time. It seems insurmountable, but our report actually goes through. There's a 108-page free download. It's not one of these things where you have to sign up for an email list or give any of your information. Just go there. There's PDF, there's Kindle version, Apple and Android version. You can just read it right there on the page. 108 pages free. The first half explains the history, the legal basis, the constitutional basis, even court cases that back up our approach for resisting and defeating federal programs on a state and local level. And then the second half shows how we're putting it into practice. And that, to me, may be far more education is so important, but this is also an educational thing. When you talk about things in theory and you tell people this is how things are supposed to happen, unless you can actually show them happening, they're thinking, well, they're going to just roll in with tanks and shut everybody down. But we know that when enough people say no and enough states or localities pass laws backing those people up, there's not much the federal government can do to force their so-called laws, regulations, or mandates down our throats. I will link to that in the show notes. Link to that in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. I'm sorry, I was actually just reading through the chat. Dan Reed had a really good one here. He says, education nowadays, and this is, of course, government run. They call it public education because they want it to sound like for the people, but it's really government indoctrination. And even those private schools out there, they still have to generally get accredited by government. So they're actually pushing things that are approved by government. He says, education nowadays means instilling fear that without government, all is lost. And that certainly is what I was taught as a kid. I thought every problem had a government solution. I proudly proclaimed myself to be a Marxist many years ago. I was probably a bad one, but I really believed. I remember thinking at the time of the airline bailout, sometime I guess in the 80s or something, hearing like, oh, government is putting all this money into airlines. Well, why doesn't government just own it? Why doesn't government just buy the airlines? Government should run all of these things. Anyways, taking a look over at the chat again, Donald Peterson, what? You don't like blank checks? And that's exactly what the founders were telling us. If you give them a blank check to do something, someone is going to take, even if you like what that blank check proposes today. And this is what I see happening on left and right all over the place. They're okay with power from their team doing it as long as it accomplishes their goal in the next 5 days. But they don't think beyond those next few days, wondering how that power might be used in the future. Giving the executive branch the power to shut down or take away, well, they shouldn't be stealing the money in the first place, but to sanction a city for doing one thing is going to give the next executive branch the power to sanction the city for something else, like the right to keep and bear arms. Hi to Justin Bayola. I appreciate you being here. Richard Kramer has a good one, a quote from Bastiat. And I know Blue North had been asking if I would do an episode on Bastiat. I'm not an expert. I've done some of the reading, but that is actually really interesting. There always seems to be an applicable quote, and Kramer points out this one. And thank you for this, Richard. When plunder becomes a way of life for a group of men in society, they create for themselves a legal system that authorizes it and a moral code that glorifies it. Anyways, I think that is a good one to sign off on. I will read through the rest of this. Oh, Susanna Sotillo over on Sotillo, I apologize if I got that wrong, on Facebook says this government is morphing into a real tyranny. I think it is today already. And again, it's not really based on whether they are trying to shut down our live stream, for example. They certainly claim the power to do basically anything, to disarm people, to interfere with their freedom of speech, their right to private property, on and on, the surveillance, the gun control, the war, the debt, the spending, all of it, the control of education. It is a tyranny even if they aren't blackbagging people every single day by the tens of thousands and locking them up in concentration camps like they did in the 1940s. Just because they're not doing it all the time, that doesn't mean they don't claim the power to do it when someone feels it is necessary in a state of fear or calamity, in an economic collapse, for example. They certainly have all the precedent to do what they need to be a historic level. Stalin, I think, would have just drooled over the surveillance powers of today. Anyways, I'm rambling. Thank you so much for being here. I'll read through the rest of the comments a little bit later on, whether they were from the live show or later on in the archive, so please continue doing that. If you support the show, there's a number of things that you can do that cost nothing to help us spread the word. Smashing a like button on any platform you're on helps us. So does subscribing, getting notifications. That ensures that you're going to join us more often. And then, of course, reviews on podcast platforms really help a ton. We actually got our most podcast downloads in a month ever. We're on a long, slow trend upward, so we're actually reaching more and more people every single month. And part of that is reviews, part of it is sharing, comments and all that stuff. Not as much so on the podcast, but the reviews help out a lot. And of course, as I mentioned at the outset, if you want to put your financial faith behind our work, like a number of people out there today who are members, thank you very much for all of you who are supporting us financially. I cannot say that enough. Thank you. If you want to join in with them, don't feel pressure to do so. We're going to continue doing this for free no matter what. When I started this organization back in 2006, I was working an $11 an hour customer service job, and my goal was to just reach a single person. I don't need this to make, this is not a money-making scheme. This is a passion of mine, something that I love and I believe in, but I'm able to do more. I'm able to expand. I'm able to hire people to help out. I've got a few people that help out part-time, but I need to be able to expand that. So the more that you're able to help me out financially, the more that we're going to reach more people with this message of the Constitution and liberty. You can do that. You can join in over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members for as little as $2 a month. Anyways, thanks again for joining me here today. I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I enjoyed sharing this information with you. I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.